The night of the galaxy stretched like a morning veil, and the suns dimmed to embers that could no longer remember their names. Citadels that once sang with triumph now whispered to their own ruins, and fleets drifted like funerary lanterns over worlds that had forgotten dawn. Across that hush, an empire leaned upon its cracked scepter and listened for a prophecy that would not speak unless paid in blood. In the Meridian Court, where banners hung like tired constellations, an immortal lord counted the cost of his unbroken heartbeat and found it wanting. He was called Vardamir by his followers and a colder word by his enemies, yet inside both names a single fear breathed, that eternity could become a cage for mercy. We who tell this tale hold you close. We truly love and care for you, wanderer, for stories are lanterns we pass from warm hand to warm hand, amid starless roads. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Vardamir stood at the balustrade of the Meridian Court and watched the day fail to arrive, the sky the colour of an old scar, and the sun hesitant, as though asking permission to rise upon a people who no longer believed in mourning. Below, cohorts held formation, while pilgrims pressed the cordon and prayed for a human answer. Lady Archeza approached like a blade learning to walk. "The Scoria shoals are dim," she said. 3 beacons went out in sequence, like steps across a river no longer there. He imagined a hand cupping each light and felt colder than declarations of war. "Interference?" he asked. "Interference is the face we give to fear," Archeza replied. "Also, an inner gate code was rewritten from a panel sealed by your signet." "Then someone has borrowed me," he said. "Find the debtor." She left a token on the rail, a cheap coin stamped with a crown of 9 broken loops. The angel arrived after she left, an administrative miracle with a voted face and the name Kalen. "Lord Defender," it said, "models prefer a coordinated quiet. If the shoals are silent, they are listening." "To what? To themselves, or to the part of us we do not supervise?" He descended into the Palace of Decisions. In the Hall of Remembered Futures, he watched simulations bloom and wither. Open the gates and commerce flowers before the roots burn. Seal the corridors and the fortress learns to love its own echo until courage forgets how to leave. Every outcome tasted of ash. Memory intruded. A winter campaign in the Amaranth Belt, a cult of shard logic shattered, a nursery of blank-eyed children reciting coordinates. He had scattered them to orphan priory ships and called it mercy. Years later, some returned wearing uniforms that fit too well. He followed Jalen's rumour into a maintenance chancel where walls remembered being alive. On a panel beside a forgotten elevator, the coin symbol had been scratched with patient defiance. 9 broken loops sheltering a small, unbroken circle. A note waited on the console. "You cannot love what cannot die." He left it where it accused him and took the elevator into archive where lives became ledgers. Jalen's quarters smelled of paper, something the palace had outlawed. Notebooks dreamed of deliverance from clocks, of leaders who ended rather than extended themselves, of an empire that would choose mortality to learn compassion before it broke. In a margin, "He does not die, therefore he cannot grieve with us." Alarms unfurled like red silk. Inner gates stuttered between closed and almost. Reports arrived. A captain who forgot his name at the oath altar. A quartermaster who became a poet and walked into the freightways reciting tides. Engineers who claimed the beacons had whispered that rest was permitted. The angel appeared again, worry set to a comforting frequency. "The house is hollowing," Kalen said. "If there is an enemy, It has borrowed our hands." "Then we will unlearn them," Vardamir murmured, and moved through the palace like a surgeon in a body that had accepted too many transplants. The throne room waited beneath a dome painted with constellations fled beyond the red horizon of history. The throne itself was a machine that preferred winners. He did not sit. He knelt because kneeling reduced the distance between choice and consequence and made the paint-flaked saints easier to speak to. Immortality had spared his people certain failures and denied them urgent compassion. 2 roads lay before him and tasted of iron: abdication with risk enough to be called love, or control with safety enough to be called sleep. Arceza found him there and did not mock the posture. "The captains will follow a decision," she said. "There is a cost either way." She set the tin crown beside him. Collect or default, and discover what mercy can build in ruins. Outside, thunder without storm rolled across the city. Processions of grey devotionaries wound through the lesser courts, bearing a reliquary rattled like caged weather. Vardamir felt the warp bruise against the augmetics beneath his collar. Prophecy tasted like metal. He turned away before the reliquary pronounced his name. He rose and knew he had not truly risen. The Empire would demand a sacrifice in either direction, the only undecided element, whether he would offer himself or everyone else. "Call the fleets to alert," he told Arceza. "Close the gates, but send food and light through every aperture we can keep honest. Find Jalen, not to punish, but to ask what song he hears that we do not." "You will be called weak," she warned. "Then I will be called," he answered. He returned to the balustrade and looked upon his people, who looked upon him as if he were a weather deciding whether to break. Above them, the sun hesitated, not dying so much as choosing. The night of the galaxy lengthened by a heartbeat, its echo like a promise, breaking or beginning. Dawn did not arrive so much as pace before the shutters, undecided, while the Meridian Court unfurled its rituals like an old wound rehearsing pain, and Vardamir walked the eastern galleries with Arceza at his flank, and Kaelin gliding behind like a thought that had learned to speak, the angel's tone polished to the calm of decisions already made. Pilgrims below held candles in cupped hands the way mothers hold soft skulls, certain the light would escape if memory unclenched, while the court scribes, sleepless and hoarse, prepared 3 versions of every proclamation to see which would survive the hour. "They wait for a word," Arceza said, her eyes tracking the ramparts, where marksmen stood like notes on a staff, each ready to become an ending. "They will crown it with hunger," he answered, thinking of the children chalking circles around sentries last night, circles that were spells or games, or simply the geometry of relief. Kaelin's optics dilated in slow sympathy. "Words are containers," the angel said, voice soft as incremental snowfall, "and sometimes the emptier they are, the more they hold." Vardamir turned the cheap coin in his palm, the 9 broken loops gnawing their tail and that single unbroken center, and felt a warmth that was not heat but attention, as if an idea recognized him and wished him courage. "Find Jalen," he murmured, and to the coin itself added, "Teach me how to spend you." They found him in the libraries beneath the kitchens, where steam and parchment braided their different humidities, and where the books had the worn spines of soldiers who returned without the need for ceremony. Jalen looked up, unstartled, as though he had invited this meeting yesterday by writing a simple sentence and leaving the window open. He offered no bow, only a chair, and Arceza's hand drifted near her holster before settling on its certainty like a bird relieved to be a stone. "You sent permission through the shoals," Vardimir said, not yet a question. I sent sleep, Jalen answered, and his voice wavered only at the vowel that meant home. You sent revolt, Arcesa corrected, but even her scorn arrived tired, like an old comrade limping through familiar doorways. I sent a reminder that life is not alone, Jalen said, and laid a reliquary on the table. A lock of hair bound by wire, a seal with the crown loops almost rubbed smooth, the faint smell of engine oil and apples, the scent of a nursery that had learned the taste of shrapnel. Kalen leaned in, light muting to dusk. Unauthorized compassion is statistically indistinguishable from sabotage during theater operations, it observed, but the angel's sentence ended with a hush that resembled prayer. Compassion is a weapon, Jalen replied, but it wounds the wielder first, and that is why it is honest. Vardimir studied the man who had written in margins and folded maps into questions, the man who had turned paper into a liturgy of endings and felt the old ache beneath his collar where eternity was bolted to bone. You think I cannot grieve, he said, remembering the line he had pretended to forget, and discovered he did not wish to win the argument anymore. I think you have outlived witnesses, Jalen said gently, and something in the room leaned closer, as though the lamps were ears. Grief without audience becomes policy or poison. Vardimir looked at Arcesa, whose loyalty had calluses, and at Kalen, whose voice had learned to imitate weather, and at the reliquary that contained proof love could be cut into a manageable shape, then breathed as a mortal would, once, and with consequence. If I end the protocols, he said, our borders will dissolve like chalk in rain. If you keep them, Jalen countered, the Empire becomes a museum that still levies taxes on the dead. Kalen's optics narrowed, computing mercy as if it were a corridor with doors that insisted on being windows, and then the angel spoke with an intimacy that made the shelves seem suddenly monastic. Propose a test, it said, narrow and reversible, with a name that sounds like a hymn. Arcesa's mouth quirked. You would turn policy into liturgy. Some liturgies keep people warm, Kalen replied, and for a fraction of a second, the angel was less instrument than interlocutor. So they walked to the quarter where the city reheated itself each morning, where the markets unrolled their skins and every debt pretended to be negotiable, and Vardimir signed a writ whose lines felt like sutures he might yet learn to tie without shaking. Sabbatical ordinance, the couriers cried as they sprinted past stalls of welding sparks and bread. 1 day in 7 for rest, passage for families through the inner gates, patrols grounded unless mercy failed. It happened before they could decide whether they had chosen wisely. A visible hush, like the parting of a crowd for a coffin that has chosen a different street. Patrols stacking rifles and sitting among the people as though hunger were a circle that could be entered without losing rank. Children looping chalk spirals around boots and laughing when the officers found they could not step out without smudging the geometry of truce. Vardimir stood in the open as himself, not a title, and some recognized him and smiled as one smiles at rain that has finally made up its mind, while others looked away to avoid being asked for permission to go on. Jalen moved through the square with the clumsiness of relief, and Arcesa counted rooftops and alleys, mapping exits with the reflexive care of kin, who has not been invited to call herself family, and Kalen recorded with the eyes of a historian who hopes the archive will feel ashamed and improve. For a little while, the city remembered how to be a story with a middle, and then the shoals quivered. Darkness did not fall so much as declare jurisdiction, the horizon shrugging on a tide-black mantle, and the silent beacons spoke in a single syllable that even stone could taste, then went quiet as if satisfied. Caelan turned its attention upward, lenses throwing tiny halos across puddles and armor. Border Logistics Authority asserts temporary sovereignty, the angel said, and Vardamir felt the coin heat in his palm, the loops brightening as though struck by a shy forge. Seraphian of Tides, Arcasa breathed, her fingers returning to steel. Who refuses audit, Vardamir added, and thought of locks that had learned to bless themselves. A second ripple rolled like a spine cracking in slow repentance, and along the rim of the sky, 9 pale crowns appeared and broke, each loop collapsing into foam, a grammar of refusal becoming a sea. The crowd drew inward without panic, as flocks do when the hawk is rumour, and Vardamir understood he had 2 doors in him, one that opened to order and one that opened to surrender, and that both could be called love depending on who was asked to pay. "Keep the ordnance," he said, and his voice carried not as command, but as promise, masquerading as weather. No retreat. Jalen touched his shoulder and did not try to make the touch mean more than contact, and Arcasa's gaze found him and allowed pride without permission, and Caelan whispered something like a blessing into the ambient, rerouting drones to deliver bread in patterns shaped like old constellations no one had agreed to forget. Thunder without a father marched across the roofs, and lanterns flickered, and the square's chalk became a map, showing where kindness had stepped and could step again, and then a final light cut through cloud like a blade, discovering it was a mirror all along. Seraphian's voice, when it came, was the measured surf of bureaucracy, a litany about flow and security and thresholds. Yet beneath the diction, Vardamir heard the tremor of an apprentice saint who had taught himself a coastline and never learned how to leave it. "Stand down your indulgence," said the sky, "or else accept a tide." "We accept," Vardamir answered, not because he agreed, but because acceptance is one way to name a field before planting it. And in the instant between his words and their consequences, he allowed himself a thin despair that felt, surprisingly, like faith. The 9 crowns dissolved. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was pregnant with the wages of choice, and the city leaned into it like a woman who knows her labour will rename a house, while the immortal lifted his face and chose to breathe again, as though the act were not rhetorical but necessary, and the first rain of the day began, astonished to find it had an audience. The rain did not stop with dawn. It thinned into needles of silver that stitched sky and stone together, as if the world were being sewn shut. In the palace of decisions, the corridors sweated with damp, and torches burned low, their light bruised by vapour. Vardamir walked alone through the archive of sovereign decrees, brushing his fingertips across the brass-sealed tablets that once declared victories, reformations, conquests. They felt like the bones of a giant who had outgrown his own body. Eternity was written here in 100 languages, yet each law now read like a plea for relevance. He felt the whisper of his own immortality, not triumph but tether, and for a moment he longed to tear the bolts from his heart and accept the end as mortals do, with fear, with dignity, with finality. Jalen had been given chambers under observation, though not confinement. Arcasa argued for chains, Caelan for discourse. Vardamir's silence had been interpreted as compromise. He found the man sitting by a dripping arch, notebook open, the ink blurred into rivers. "You named me Hollow," Vardamir said. Jalen did not look up. "I named you Unaccompanied. There is a difference." The words were neither accusation nor apology, and the immortal realized the wound was not meant to kill, but to remind him that wounds still existed. Arcesa arrived unannounced, armor damp with weather, eyes sharp with unrest. The captains murmur of treachery. They think mercy opens gates for invasion. Vardamir regarded her. Do they think walls alone can keep them sovereign? She almost smiled, almost broke. They think walls are simpler than choices. Soldiers prefer borders to paradox. Kaelin drifted in behind her, the angel's form shimmering with condensation, and offered a quiet ledger. The shoals were restless, patrols mutinous, families uncertain whether the Sabbath was gift or trap. Statistical projection, Kaelin said, favors fracture unless an integrating myth is provided within 9 cycles. A myth, Jalen echoed, bitterly soft. What you mean is a lie. Arcesa's hand twitched toward her blade. What you call lies hold men together in the storm. Vardamir raised a hand, and the silence between them was cathedral. He spoke slowly, as though engraving each syllable on the wet air. Myth is the breath we give to truth when it cannot yet stand alone. If I craft one, it will not be to lie but to anchor. If I refuse, the empire drifts and drowns in itself. They stared at him, each seeing a different leader. Arcesa, a sovereign who must be iron. Jalen, a relic that must be broken to free the people. Kaelin, a variable that must be balanced for the equation to function. None of them were wrong. That was the tragedy. He climbed the northern tower that evening, where the rain turned to mist, and the horizon resembled parchment too often rewritten. Below, the city moved with a strange hush, not peace but expectancy, like a heart that waits for its next beat, uncertain if it will come. He remembered the campaign in the Amaranth Belt, where after a decisive victory, he had stood among corpses of enemies who looked too much like his own men, and wondered if conquest was anything more than repeating funerals until you forgot who deserved mourning. That was when he had chosen immortality, to ensure his empire did not scatter into dust like those nameless armies. Now, centuries later, he saw the irony. To preserve unity, he had become the very distance that eroded it. Arcesa joined him on the tower, helm under her arm, rain streaking her scarred cheek. You think too long, she said softly. The world waits for decisions, not meditations. He looked at her, loyal beyond reason, and asked, would you betray me if I chose wrong? She did not blink. I would betray you if you chose silence. For the first time in decades, he felt the edge of respect cut through his weariness. Later, Kaelin brought him reports of the shoals. The beacons had flickered again, a language of broken crowns traced in light. Seraphian of tides, the unseen power, was not retreating but watching. Their patience is orchestration, the angel murmured. They are conducting us into dissonance. Vardamir knew then that external war was inevitable, yet it was the inner fractures that would shatter them before any enemy fire. He went again to Jalen, this time alone. Tell me, he said, if the empire dies, what is left? Jalen closed his book. Stories. Children will remember not your decrees, not your victories, but whether you allowed them to be human. That will be the empire that survives. The words pressed on him like a crown of thorns. Painful, humbling, yet undeniable. That night dreams found him, a rarity for the undying. He dreamed of chains, each link forged from a century of rule, wrapping not around him but around his people, binding them to his immortality. In the dream, he pulled the chains tighter, and they turned to dust in his hands, leaving only silence. He woke with rain still falling, with his coin still warm, and with a decision that felt like both salvation and betrayal. At dawn, he stood before the captains, the generals, the bureaucrats, who mistook procedure for prophecy. The hall was full of iron and parchment, but he carried only the cheap coin with its broken loops. "We are not infinite," he said, voice ringing against stone. "We are a people who forgot the gift of ending. I chose eternity once, thinking it mercy. I see now it was vanity. To rule forever is not to love, but to deny love its measure." "That ends," murmurs rippled, outrage clothed in ritual. Arquiza stiffened, caught between devotion and fear. Kaelin recorded every vibration, its eyes like votive flames. Jalen bowed his head, not in triumph but in sorrow. Vardamir raised the coin. 9 broken crowns for 9 centuries of rule. 1 unbroken circle remains. I will not bind it to myself. We will craft succession, mortality, renewal. The empire will bleed, yes, but it will live. In that instant he felt the palace breathe differently, as though stone itself weighed his words. The empire's foundations trembled, not from collapse, but from the possibility of change. Outside, the rain ceased, and the sky revealed a star not seen in 100 years. Yet beneath the awe he saw the glances, the whispers, the eyes that promised betrayal. He had chosen, and that choice had sown both hope and doom. Eternity had been a prison. Mortality would be war, and he, immortal still, would live to see whether love could survive the blood it demanded. Night arrived like a verdict written in water, and the Meridian Court held its breath as if lungs were contraband. Vardamir's decree moved through the city like an aftershock. Succession among the living, immortality to step back, mercy to be tested in daylight. Rumors are hands. Some carried salve, others hid small knives between their fingers. Arquiza walked the barracks counting boots and silences. Kaelin hovered through galleries like a prayer learning mathematics. Rain needled the roofs and stitched alleys to the river. At third bell, Vardamir convened council in the Hall of Instruments, where maps were taught to confess. Captains arrived with folded tempers, and magistrates with pockets practicing humility. 3 electors sent proxies perfumed like careful letters. "Seraphian of Ty's test by offering," Kaelin said. "They send warnings dressed as kindness. We should answer with kindness that warns." Arquiza slid a portfolio across the stone. Requisitions under emergency liturgy had redirected Sabbath rations to favored cohorts. "Someone is building a god from ration bars," she said. Jalen's mouth tightened. Hunger-born gods bless no one. Vardamir closed the folio. "We invited choice, and choice invites thieves. We will not answer theft with famine, nor fear with theatre. We will answer with witnesses." He ordered a candidacy conclave in 7 nights with names from every ward, including the unlanded. Witnesses would be chosen by lot and seated where eyes could not be avoided. "Let endings be seen," he said, and Jalen's pen finally paused. Word outran decree like spark, outruns flame. In a river school, a teacher named Sira drew 9 broken crowns and 1 unbroken circle on a slate. "A crown is a promise you share so it does not crush a single skull," she told the class. When evening fell, a quiet woman with soldier posture offered Sira a ride and questions that held their breath. Sira declined, and rain obliged her with a hood. That night a note bloomed on the school door. "We prefer thrones that never sleep." Audience hours opened beneath the Meridian dome. Petitioners arrived like swallows discovering rafters. A veteran poured medals from a brine jar and asked that his grandson never polish grief. A baker requested flour for Sabbath ovens because mercy burns fuel. A young woman asked if she could stand for succession, though she owned neither house nor history. "Bring what you are," Vladimir said, tasting the hazard and accepting it. Some blessings sound like instructions. Some warnings pretend to be love. The shoals pulsed. Seraphian's communique arrived as weather, flood advisories threading the delta with careful chains. In the footnotes, 9 pale crowns broke and re-knit in luminous script. "They want us to remember how easy obedience feels when the water rises," Kalen said. "They want drowning to resemble order," Jalen added. "And you," Vladimir asked, "what do you want?" "I want them to learn to swim." Evening lifted the smell of wet stone and boiled grain. Stalls turned into shrines. Bread lay on clean cloths, as if ghosts had decent table manners. Soldiers and citizens traded stories beneath rusted awnings like maps for crossing grief. A girl of 10 winters halted Vladimir, who wore a plain cloak and anonymity. "Do you want to see a trick?" she asked. He said yes, because yes is the password of those who still mean to be interrupted by wonder. She drew a chalk ring and challenged him to step free without smudging. He laughed at himself and found the exit, and the ring forgave him. For a pocket of seconds, the Empire practiced breathing. When he returned, an envoy waited with the expression of rehearsed neutrality. The chorus of adamant requested audience and entered like a sermon in marching order. Vestments were laced with wire. Hymns hummed faintly under cloth. Their Primarch, white-haired, eyes too bright, spoke first. "Your abdication of eternity is dereliction," she said, gentle as a blanket and equally suffocating. "A throne is a vow, not a diet." "A vow to whom?" Vladimir asked. "To duration," she answered. "To the comfort of tomorrow resembling yesterday." He dismissed them because spectacle would feed them. Betrayal knocked as softly as a mother waking a child for travel. Sira was found at dawn in the river culverts, coughing silt, a cord around her throat. On her palms she traced numbers, and Arkessa translated them into 3 names. 2 were minor electors. 1 was a captain whose loyalty always smiled with too many teeth. Kalen analyzed the fibers and matched them to a registry within choir workshops. "Circumstantial," the angel said. "Sufficient for caution," Arkessa replied. Vladimir knelt beside Sira. "Should I stop?" he asked. She shook her head and wrote on a slate, "If you stop, they will finish us." At first light, he addressed the city from the Meridian balustrade as neighbor, not idol. He said fear would be welcome at the conclave, but not allowed to vote. He said the Sabbath would endure and bread would find every door known to maps or memory. He did not name the choir. Wire has a scent incense cannot hide. The answer rose like early spring, cautious, stubborn, imperfectly green. Seraphian replied with rain from a clear sky that fell only upon palace and barracks, leaving markets dry. In the drops, tiny metallic flakes sang against stone. Arkessa tested them. Beacon ash, the burnt handwriting of lighthouses. "A warning," she judged. "Our signature," Kalen said. "They want to be the weather we deserve." Negotiations began with captains who had requisitioned under liturgy. Vladimir met them in a hall where frescoes showed kings giving their crowns to rivers. "Your loyalty is to people," he told them, "not to a ritual that asks you to forget their faces." One captain laughed like a hinge that had learned cruelty. "People change," he said. "Ritual doesn't." Vladimir stepped close until metal under his skin scented the air. "Exactly," he said. "That is why rituals require gardeners." Arkessa's eyebrow betrayed the smallest, fiercest smile. Evening returned, and with it a necessary quiet. He climbed the northern tower and watched a long hidden star thread the cloud like a stitch closing a wound. He thought of chalk rings, ration gods, priests who mistook control for care, captains who adored orders because orders never asked them to grow, and an enemy who painted contempt with weather. He knew betrayal would return. He knew choice would arrive asking for more blood than counsel. He rested his palm on the cheap coin, and the unbroken center seemed to pulse like a child sleeping against the ribs. Below, the city slept like a patient between surgeries. In the deep hours, the 9 electors gathered by candle and oath. Sira's voice was rough but steady. Arcasa's gaze was a shield without a wielder. Kalen counted breath as evidence. Jalen wrote one line in the choosing book's margin. Let endings be witnessed by those who will live with them. Vladimir watched from the threshold and refused to be the weight that tipped the scale. He turned away before the tally began and walked into rain that had finally remembered how to be ordinary. The shoals murmured in the wires, and far beyond the walls, 9 pale crowns unfurled and broke, reminding the night that breaking is how some promises become everywhere. The conclave did not open with trumpets, but with silence, the kind that made parchment sound like thunder and footsteps like confessions. The electors gathered beneath the meridian dome, where light filtered through stained glass cracked by centuries of weather and war. The city had come to the threshold and pressed its breath against the gates, listening through rumor, waiting for its own sentence to be written. Vladimir stood apart, not seated on his throne, not even at the center dais, but at the edge like a pilgrim who had wandered too close to a shrine. His presence was both permission and warning. Arcasa scanned the chamber with eyes that turned affection into vigilance. Her hand hovered near her sword as if betrayal had already chosen a seat. Kalen floated in the gallery, luminous yet hushed, every gesture a record that would outlive the participants. Jalen sat among the witnesses, his notebook balanced on his knee, the ink ready to bleed truth or doom into history. The first name was called a farmer, thin as the reeds of the delta, who spoke not of politics, but of seasons. We know the rhythm of growth and fall, he said. Let rulers learn harvest as we do, by surrendering to cycles, not escaping them. His words were plain, but they rang like bells through a hall long accustomed to ornate lies. Then came a merchant, her robe heavy with coins stitched into the seams. Continuity, she argued, is the blood that keeps markets alive. If rulers die like mortals, trade dies with them. She spoke of stability as though it were a god that ate only certainty. Arcasa muttered under her breath, "Gold prefers ghosts to gamble." And Vladimir heard, but did not correct her. Through the hours the chamber swelled with arguments, some born of faith, some of fear. A general demanded that the throne remain eternal, for only an undying sovereign could resist the endless tides of Seraphian. A teacher countered that eternity was precisely what had led them to the brink of obedience to storms. And in each argument, Vladimir felt the threads of empire pull tighter and looser, a tapestry fraying as it wove. When dusk arrived, candles lit the dome like constellations resurrected. It was then the betrayal whispered in. An elector, one of the 3 whose name Sira had traced with her dying fingers, rose with a speech already memorized in his bones. He praised Vladimir, exalted the mercy of the Sabbath, but beneath each word lay a current pulling toward the abyss. We must allow renewal, he declared, but only under the guidance of the eternal. Let the throne remain immortal, yet appoint mortal stewards to enact his will. Gasps murmured like insects through the chamber. The proposal was compromise disguised as poison, eternity preserved, choice reduced to theatre. Some applauded, eager for the safety of half measures. Others hissed, sensing the trap. Vardamir closed his eyes. He could feel the coin in his palm burning, the 9 broken crowns circling the unbroken one, as if reminding him that fractures cannot be mended by pretending they never happened. Jalen stood suddenly, breaking protocol. "That is not renewal," he shouted, his voice raw. "That is chaining life to a corpse and calling it dance." Guard stirred. Arkesa's hand tightened on her sword, but Vardamir lifted his palm, and silence fell. "Let him speak," he commanded. Jalen's eyes burned with a sorrow that looked like fury. "You all fear death so much that you would build a world of sleepwalkers. But love requires endings. Without endings, loyalty rots into habit, and courage becomes a costume. If you keep him on that throne forever, you kill us slowly, and the Empire will deserve its grave." The words struck the chamber like a blade across glass. Some electors rose in outrage, others in awe. The captain, whose name Sira had scrawled, leaned forward, his gaze too calm, too certain. Vardamir saw then how betrayal was not always noise. It could be stillness preparing to pounce. Night deepened, and so did the tension. The vote was called, each elector rising, speaking their choice. Some chose mortality, some eternity, some compromise. The air grew thick with consequence. When the final elector spoke, the tally split into 3 nearly equal parts. No resolution reached, only fracture made visible. The hall erupted into chaos. Shouts, accusations, hands reaching for weapons. Arkesa barked orders, her voice slicing through the din. Kalan amplified itself, projecting chords of calming frequencies that trembled in the marrow, but chaos was a seed already sown. It was then the beacons flared. Through the stained glass, the night sky erupted with 9 crowns of pale fire, breaking and reforming, casting the dome in sickly light. Seraphion had chosen its moment. Thunder followed, not of weather, but of artillery echoing from the shoals. War had arrived at their doorstep. The chamber froze. Every face turned skyward. Vardamir's voice cut through the silence. "So be it. You wanted endings. They have come. Now you must choose not with words, but with lives." The captains scrambled, some running to rally their cohorts, others hesitating, torn between empire and ambition. The merchant, who had spoken of stability, fled, coins clattering behind her like accusations. The farmer knelt and prayed to soil he could not touch. Arkesa approached Vardamir, her face pale with the light of burning crowns. "They will call this your fault," she said. "They will say you invited this storm." "Perhaps I did," he replied. "Perhaps storms are the only mirrors eternity respects." Jalen stepped beside him, eyes wide with the reflection of fire. "This is the cost," he whispered. "To love mortals is to risk their ruin." Vardamir placed the coin on the stone table, its edges glowing faintly. "Then let ruin teach us how to begin." Outside, the first barrage struck the outer gates. The dome shuddered, glass trembling in its leaden frame. The Empire had been given its choice, and now it would pay its price in blood. And Vardamir, immortal still, knew that the hardest betrayals were not yet made. They waited, patient, in the faces of those he trusted most. The first shells fell like verdicts, punching consonants into the meridian walls until the dome learned to speak in shivers. Smoke braided with incense, so prayer smelled of engines, and the hall of decisions became a wound that refused stitches. Vardamir moved through corridors where dust rose as petitions and settled as doubt, his cloak heavy with storm metal and old parchment. Arkeeza shadowed him, helm on, mouth a disciplined line that already forgave him for whatever the choice would cost. Kaelin drifted alongside like a calm equation. Light dimmed, so panic could not borrow its voice. Outside, the shoals rang with artillery phrased as policy. 9 pale crowns strobed across the horizon in lawful cadence. Proof that bureaucracy could rehearse awe. Between those pulses, the enemy advanced as documents advance, quietly, inevitably, countersigned by no living hand. Rain stitched sky to stone and turned every step into punctuation. Hold the inner gates, Vardamir said. Yield the outer. Trade ground for lives and time for witness. Arkeeza relayed orders with the steadiness of someone who loves in verbs, while some captains obeyed and others argued in the dialect of tradition. One, the smiling captain from Sierra's slate, requested clarification in a tone that was already refusal, and Arkeeza placed him under arrest with humiliating gentleness. Within the second barrage came the uncounted thing, an absence that bent signals around itself. Beacons did not go dark. They remembered other skies. Reports arrived of silhouettes folding into corners where geometry promised emptiness, of crews pausing mid-ritual to weep because they were children again, and the war had their father's voice. Seraphion of Tides has opened a sluice in recollection, Kaelin warned. They are weaponizing memory. The inner wards recharted themselves into a geography of vows. Sabbath kitchens ran at war temperature. Bread moving in convoy along alleys chalked into corridors of truce. Families crossed gates that recognized their names because Kaelin taught the gates to listen. Drones sketched circles on rooftops to confuse artillery, and in those circles, children played games that required believing you could step out without smudging hope. Then the unseen shadow entered the theatre, not by breaking doors, but by wearing faces. A sergeant approached Arkeeza with yesterday's grief in his eyes and asked for orders he already carried. He led his squad to a maintenance chancel, sealed them in, and spoke evenly into a throat mic, while gas unrolled like parchment that preferred lungs. Rumour sparked and learned arithmetic. Everywhere the same motif appeared. Someone with exactly the right sadness doing exactly the wrong thing. Jalen wrote in the margins that despair had acquired uniforms. Under the archives, reliquary vaults groaned. Cages of oaths, rings and seals and vox crystals singing with promises pledged by tongues long since ash, vibrated as if summoning their owners across seasons. Vardamir entered alone. He had not built the vaults, yet they knew his fingerprints. The coin burned against his skin, the unbroken circle throbbing like a heart deciding whether to resume. He set it on a plinth, and the lights recalibrated to the colour of regret. "Eternity," he whispered. "I defended you because I feared we would unravel without you. If I keep you, we will unravel tighter." Kaelin found him and spoke softly. "The unseen is an accounting engine. It amortizes hope, requests receipts for love, and cannot compute loss that is chosen." "Then we must choose it," Vardamir answered, tasting the sentence like cutting a ring from a swollen finger. He took up the coin and returned to the Meridian Court, where witnesses gathered. Fear, singing in diapason. Arkeeza brought news that the choir workshops were abandoned in glorious order, each wire coiled, each tool cleaned, each lisong filed. The neatness frightened her more than blood. "It means they expect to come home," she said. "Then we will leave the doors open and the tables set," Vardamir replied. She regarded him as one trusts a cliff, because it has never moved, You are daring them to humanize, she said. I am daring us, he answered. The first breach in the outer ward arrived with dignity. Amphora walkers halted, opened, and released negotiators in armor that mimicked patience. Their leader's helm bore 9 pale loops, each loop swelling and breaking like a tide that did not know the shore's name. We recognize your Sabbath as anomaly, the leader intoned. Permit custodial presence to regularize it. The sentence was an offer carved from confiscation. We will keep our own rest, Vardamir replied. Not loud, not theatrical, simple as bread. At that, the unseen changed key. The negotiator's visor cleared and revealed Vardamir's face from an earlier century. Eyes bright with doctrine, jaw unbruised by concession. Around him stood mirrors of Arkeesa, younger, unscarred, loyalty still shiny enough to cut. Beside them, a pristine Kaelin manifested, voice tuned to the floor that always wins arguments. Memory had made itself legion and argued for empire as it had been. The square wavered. Some knelt. Others laughed too loudly to keep from breaking. Vardamir stepped forward until his ghost could smell him. You were beautiful, he told the old self. You won the wars that let me learn to lose. I honor you. I will not marry you again. He raised the coin. The 9 broken crowns shone like cauterized arteries, while the unbroken center stayed modest as a kept promise. Witness, he said, and pressed the coin to the bolts beneath his collar where immortality nested. There was no scream, only a soft click, a key declining a lock. The ghost blinked like a doctrine discovering air. For a heartbeat, the reflections looked confused, as if waiting for a cue that refused to arrive. Then they thinned into weather and were gone. Artillery rushed to replace argument. The ramparts answered with reluctance. The city held its breath and exhaled bread. Arkeesa led a counter that looked like a rescue, not a hunt. Kaelin rewrote targeting permissions so any weapon sighted through a child's chalk ring forgot how to fire. Jalen stood in the square reading names aloud. Dead, living, missing, until names built a bridge people could cross to reach one another. Evening turned smoke to rose and the 9 crowns dimmed, while a 10th hesitation appeared. Not a loop, but an ellipse, as if the enemy had remembered error. They are learning, Kaelin said, astonished. Or adjusting, Arkeesa warned. Vardamir felt light-headed, the coin cool now, an ordinary circle with a history of refusing perfection. He knew the war would continue, that the next assault would use hunger, then ritual, then love. He knew also that something within the Empire had decided to survive him, rather than obey him. Night took the field without triumph, and the wounded discovered bargains they could keep. A soldier gave his ration to a child and received a lullaby he would need a year from now. A baker burned her hands and decided the scars were holidays. Jalen finished reading and began listening. Arkeesa sat with helmet off and watched the stars remember their posts. Kaelin dimmed to a votive and let the city dream without supervision. Vardamir climbed the northern tower alone. The air tasted like a ledger closed honestly. From here, the Empire looked less like a body and more like a conversation that would survive the loss of any single voice. He placed the coin on the parapet and did not ask it for permission. He thought of Syrah's chalk, of amphorae cracking like polite arguments, of earlier faces begging to be obeyed. I love you, he told the dark. I love you enough to let you end. The shoals answered with a hush that rolled like a slow tide turning back from a mistaken shore. Far off, lightning mapped the bureaucratic heart of Seraphion, line by line. Between strokes he felt the unbroken circle pulse once, not promise, but acknowledgement. Below, bells called stretcher teams to quiet heroism and ovens to second shifts. The city, imperfect and unafraid for a moment, held itself together by ordinary courage. Vladimir lowered his head and allowed weariness to arrive without shame. He understood that immortality would not surrender in a single click, and that the unseen shadow would return wearing newer faces. Yet something fundamental had tilted. The Empire had tasted a future where endings were part of the recipe and not contamination. This taste would complicate every betrayal to come. He gathered the coin and turned from the wind, prepared to spend another night buying time with choices no one else could carry, while the 9th bell counted the distance between what had been and what might still deserve to be. He watched the city breathe, counted the survivors, and chose to keep listening through the dark. The city woke to a sky hammered flat like armor left too long on an anvil, and the shoals wrote their lawsuits in pale fire, while ovens burned a second dawn into streets salted with ash. Vladimir left the northern tower before the bells remembered their number and walked among barricades that looked more like bread tables than walls, because mercy was still the Empire's most stubborn fortification. Arquiza briefed him as they moved. 2 outer forts withdrawn by design, a third holding out of pride. Choir workshops emptied with the precision of a confession rehearsed too well. Along the river hinged a chain of barges spelling a sentence clerks refused to read aloud. Kaelin's radiance dimmed to a pilgrim's candle. Its voice arrived as a ledger of risks, each line ending in a human face. Jalen walked with witnesses, collecting names like kindling, promising to burn them only for warmth. The conclave's debris of arguments lay tucked under chairs like forgotten blades, and everywhere the Sabbath's stubborn glow tried to teach fear a smaller alphabet. From the shoals the first salvos learned their way through cloud, striking warehouses turned to kitchens. Flour rose like secular incense, the air tasting of bread refusing to surrender its future. Vladimir ordered the ovens tripled and corridors cleared, not in retreat but in reverence, because a city that stops feeding itself admits a defeat sharper than steel. Arquiza arranged patrols into loops that intersected at corners where children drew rings. She told her sergeants any weapon stepping inside a child's geometry would forget its purpose, and Kaelin wrote that forgetfulness into the scopes. The smiling captain, ash-chinned from a night of arguments, begged to cleanse hesitation with bravery. Arquiza gave him a decoy post and 3 witnesses to love him out loud until he remembered which side of mercy he had promised to die on. The first wave came as hymns through loud hailers disguised as rain, each note coaxing muscle memory to kneel. Squads faltered until Arquiza sang back an uglier barracks tune she had never admitted she knew, rhythm as inoculation, and the lines stiffened into laughter that held. Drones traced chalk rings onto tank decks, so gunners hesitated before firing into circles that promised childhood. A girl from the river school worked triage with a stolen satchel, and a look of authority that turned officers into apprentices. When Vladimir thanked her, she asked if the Sabbath applied to stitches, and he told her yes. Rest is the suture we lend to time. Seraphian's second movement arrived as accuracy. Artillery landed between medics and stretchers, in alleys where bread lines curled like commas, on roofs where drones waited for nouns. Kaelin narrowed its brilliance to a wire, threading lies into range tables. For 17 minutes the shoals bombarded an empty plaza, because the angel convinced their mathematics it was the capital's soul. "You are learning to sin," Jalen told it. "I am learning to confess," Kaelin replied. recording the cost beside relief. At midday, the chorus of adamant returned in linen over chain and gilt over strategy. Their Primarch set a lighthouse reliquary on the steps. "We will join you," she said, "if you rescind the Sabbath until victory. Rest teaches cowards to multiply." The square inhaled as if it had found decisive metal. Vardamir's fingers closed over the coin and felt a refusal older than him. "We keep the Sabbath," he said. "Then your dead will keep you," the Primarch answered, withdrawing, the lighthouse staring like light as discipline. Afternoon brought the storm crouched since dawn. Amphora walkers disgorged infantry in silver hoods masked to resemble relatives half remembered. Lines wavered as soldiers mistook approach for reunion. Arcasa seized a banner, ripped it, tied strips round her wrists so gestures became orders visible through confusion. Vardamir lifted a fallen shutter pinning 2 children with an economy learned from centuries of refusing to show off. His bolts clicked inside his spine like old chains remembering rain. Seraphian changed key, releasing smoke that smelled of winter kitchens. A squad halted, suspecting memory, until Jalen stepped among them and read names, and the roll call built a bridge steadier than orders. By late hour, the enemy floated pardons promising safety to any cohort that arrested the immortal for neutral stewardship. The smiling captain folded one into a crane and burned it. Arcasa watched his face and believed him for the first time that week. Toward evening, the beacons dimmed to juridical dusk. Reports came of a breach at the river hinge, barges shackled into a pontoon shaped like an argument. Arcasa took 2 cohorts and a prayer she didn't say aloud. Vardamir walked with her to the gate. "If I fall, bury me under the bakery. I want a riser's heat," she said. "If you fall, I will teach the oven your name," he answered, and her laugh became armor. Night arrived wearing paperwork. Curfew scrolled across sky screens in fonts that had never made a mistake. Seraphian claimed jurisdiction over compassion for security purposes. Bread convoys were halted by polite checkpoints, asking for loyalty receipts stamped in yesterday's ink. Jalen slipped between cordons, reminding witnesses their task remained. Record ending so beginnings would have shame. The coin cooled in Vardamir's hand like thought deciding not to become doctrine. Near midnight, the river hinge sent up a column of smoke, serrated with blue. Arcasa's voice arrived through Vox scraped raw but intact. Breach held, cost severe, choir deacons routed, pontoon arguments set on fire until it learned to be wood again. She added nothing of herself, which told him enough. He answered, "Bread is waiting," and Kaelin dimmed in gratitude that looked like grief. Just before the 7th bell, when fatigue turned centuries into poets, a procession approached the Meridian Gate. Elders in plain robes, hands visible, singing no song at all. Their leader stepped forward, face uncovered. It was Sierra's father. He asked entrance to return the chalk ring his daughter had drawn around a soldier's boot and to deliver thanks for justice. The guards hesitated, then opened a slot in good faith, and gratitude blossomed into knives, sleek as signatures. The first cut took a century from Vardamir's shoulder. The second missed his throat because a child shouted a wrong number at the right time. Arcasa's cohort crashed back from the river like weather with a memory, and Kaelin flooded the gate with a tone that made metal ashamed to be sharp. The elders' robes fell to reveal choir armor hammered thin, enough to pass for repentance. Vardamir stepped into the breach and raised the coin. "Witness," he said, and a hush came that could have been sleep learning to be law. He pressed the circle to the gate's lockwork and severed the immortal override that had kept the palace obedient to one pulse for 9 centuries. The hinges sighed, relieved to belong to the living. The choir faltered, confused that a door could refuse eternity. Arkeesa reached him, blood on her lips like borrowed lipstick, eyes bright with the kind of victory that costs later. She put her back to his and laughed once, forgiveness enough for the night. Jalen arrived with lantern bearers the color of patient verdicts. They formed a ring around the fallen and recorded without hatred. The enemy withdrew, not routed but made thoughtful, leaving a lighthouse reliquary cracked along a seam that spelled almost. Vardamir looked at the gate, at the city breathing as if it had invented lungs, at the coin cooling in his palm, and knew every mercy from here would be paid in installments with interest set by grief. Then the sky went still, and a single beacon burned above the river where none should be, its crown unbroken. In that impossible steadiness, he heard a voice he had taught himself never to hear again, say his name like a verdict and a vow, and the knight leaned forward to listen. The unbroken beacon burned above the river with a steadiness that felt like a hand on the city's sternum, and the voice that came through it carried his name as if it had been warmed in the mouth for years, waiting for the right winter to speak. Vardamir. The sound crossed water and stone without echo, a claim rather than a call. Arkeesa took one careful step nearer, which for her was alarm. Kaelin dimmed so its glow looked borrowed from a votive. Jalen lifted his lantern and lowered his gaze. Witness apprenticing itself to reverence. You have unfastened yourself from the lock, the voice said, neither condemning nor kind. Now unfasten yourself from yourself. He recognized the cadence before he saw the skiff. It cut the current like an idea that had learned to steer. A standard of woven receipts fluttered at its prow in lieu of a banner. At the stern stood a woman in river grey, hair tied in a knot that refused apology. Auriel. Once she had mapped his campaigns with rivers left unstraightened, arguing that roads which pretend water is a rumour grow lonely and genocidal. She had left him before the Amaranth Belt taught him how to bury mercy inside doctrine. She had left vowing to prove that endings could be governance rather than decay. Now the beacon wore her timbre as if it owed her interest. She came ashore beneath the cracked stairs and did not bow. You learned to refuse the key, she said, eyes glancing to the collar where his immortal bolts had clicked and declined. I learned it because you left, he answered, and the truth sat between them like a guest neither dared to feed. First, Arkeesa planted herself where her shadow touched his boots. Kaelin drifted back a finger's breadth, gifting privacy by pretending to become a lamp. Jalen wrote a single word, returning, and did not underline it. Seraphion is not my sovereign, Auriel said. It is whether we have decided to read rather than resist. We built a harbour in its lee for those tired of perfection, pilots, shirkers of certainty, parents who need endings to mean rest and not exile. We will not ask your throne. We ask for crossings, food, medicine, ideas. Audits, Kaelin murmured, as if trust were a scaffolding one owed receipts for. Audit me, Auriel replied, but do not audit the river. It will revise its books while you are still counting. Vardamir heard the bargain as promise and threat. Honest bargains ring with both. And what do you want of me? Begin from regret, she said simply. Stop hiding it inside policy. Let your people watch you change. He imagined the steps and the ovens arguing with light, the vigil and the Sabbath trading weather, and discovered he did not wish to win against either. Help me, he said. Good, she answered. Start there. The river rose a hand width in a breath. Seraphion adjusted current like a clerk amending a schedule, and barges slewed toward Crush. Arkeesa swore with economy and threw lines, Kalen taught doors new hinges with a whisper. Vardamir waded until water licked the bolts in his spine and shouldered crates of antibiotics with the steadiness of a man who has moved too many bodies. Oriel called depth and talk as if the river confided in her alone. For an hour they worked together and forgot to dislike each other's doctrines. When the flood fell back by a finger, Oriel tied the skiff and stood close enough for memory to become pain rather than instruction. "The harbour carries a narrative you will hate," she murmured. "In it you die, not as punishment, as pedagogy." Arkesa's hand found her sword and did not move further. "I have already died a little," Vardamir said. "I refuse to subcontract the rest." "Then live harder," Oriel said. "Live where endings are public." A herald arrived, breath lit with running. "The chorus of adamant has assembled on the sanctuary steps," he gasped. "They promise a vigil to cleanse doubt." "Candles with knives attached," Oriel said. "Let me speak." "They will name you heretic," Arkesa warned. "They already name me wave," Oriel replied. "A wave does not ask a rock for permission to be water." They climbed the steps beneath a sky scrawled by beacons issuing pale punctuation. The Primarch waited with obedience armoured and singing under its breath. The lighthouse reliquary's cracked seam shone almost. "Choose shore or sea," she intoned. "No house survives damp walls." Oriel stepped into the candlelight and broke none of it. "Houses by rivers learn to float," she answered. "You call that chaos. I call it childhood." Murmurs rose, some like prayer, some like court stenography. The Primarch turned to Vardamir. "Will you renounce the Sabbath until victory?" "No." "Will you renounce your surrender to endings?" "I have surrendered nothing," he said. "I have begun." "Then we begin our vigil," she declared. Candles multiplied until stone looked like a sky that had chosen not to move. Oriel touched her brow to his for the length of a breath. Intimacy that could be mistaken for nostalgia, and was in fact strategy. "They will not sleep," she warned. "They will invoice their suffering and ask you to pay by becoming again what you were." "I am busy learning shame," he said, and felt the sentence clean a space in him like rain in a kiln. Night laid its ledger on the city and drew patient lines. The vigil burned without eating, the Sabbath cooked without boasting. People moved between them, learning a grammar that let hunger and holiness conjugate without cruelty. Jalen read names until the living began answering for the dead. He stopped and listening became policy for an hour. Kalen tuned the ovens to breathe warmth toward the steps and pretended it was wind. Arkesa watched the edges, where betrayals usually begin. Close to dawn, the beacon brightened as if satisfied with a proof. A second voice arrived, his own cadence from a younger century, victory still tight around the waist. "Stand down indulgence," it said. "Resume continuity." The vigil shifted, encouraged. The crowd leaned as wheat leans when weather predicts itself. Vardamir stepped into the center and lifted the coin so the 9 broken crowns caught firelight like sutured arteries, while the unbroken circle refused spectacle. "I will resume nothing," he said softly. "I will proceed." Softness traveled better than thunder. The steps heard it and had to translate themselves to catch up. "Then prove you are not theatre," the Primarch said. "Name a grief you will not outsource to ritual." He thought of Sira, of the sergeant with yesterday's sadness, of children chalking mercy into geometry, of Oriel leaving because he would not, of soldiers taught to love orders more than faces. "I grieve the years I taxed surprise to buy safety," he said. "I grieve that I taught courage to dress as habit. I grieve making policy carry my fear. A candle popped in relief. Oriel's shoulders loosened as if a bridge had accepted its own weight. Arquiza looked at him like a wall discovering a door. Kalen recorded, then deleted the recording and kept only the fact of deletion. The Primarch studied him for the seam of conversion and found none she could prosecute. "Words," she said. "Witness," he answered, and opened the palace gates so Kitchens could feed the fasting, and the fasting could see Kitchens refuse to starve them into saints. Near noon, the shoal sent a weather of pamphlets that stuck to wet stone and skin. Each promised pardons to any cohort that restored neutral stewardship. Arquiza gathered them and fed them to ovens with unceremonious piety. Jalen saved one and wrote in the margin, "Not for amnesty." Toward evening, a hush moved through the steps as a child climbed to Vladimir and offered him a chalk ring. "Can you get out?" she asked. He stepped in and did not move. "Not yet," he said, "but I will not ask you to draw it smaller." She nodded with the authority of childhood and went to teach a captain how to stand inside mercy without feeling disarmed. When the first stars stitched themselves to the dome of smoke, Oriel stood again at the river stair. "I return to the harbour," she said. "Your vigil must tire. The choir must fail. Keep the Sabbath. Feed the watchers. Make policy show its hands. And you, I will teach the river to wear down the shoals by attrition of kindness." She leaned close, and for a heartbeat, they were almost the age when they had invented their quarrels. "Do not mistake me," she whispered. "I did not come to save you. I came to save the mouth of the river. If you are standing there when it is spared, I will not be sorry." She left before he decided whether that was mercy or merely weather. The beacon held, unbroken. The vigil burned, stubborn. The ovens breathed, faithful. Vladimir stood between bread and flame and realized that doubt had ceased to be a trespass. It had become a citizen with work to do and wages to demand. He turned the coin in his palm and listened to the older cadence of himself falter at a distance, as if even memory were practicing a different way to breathe. The night after the vigil bled into a dawn the colour of worn bronze, and the unbroken beacon still glared above the river, steady as a verdict that refused appeal. The city's roofs were dusted with pamphlet ash, and ovens exhaled their thin warmth into streets damp with sermons that would not dry. Vladimir walked the northern parapets, while the people stirred below, uncertain whether to call the long watch survival or delay. Every lantern guttered with the same question: how long can bread contend with fire? Arquiza joined him, armour strapped with haste, one eye bruised from the river clash. "The chorus sharpened their vigil into law," she said. "They demand every household send a candle to the steps before dusk. They call refusal heresy." Vladimir touched the coin, its edges dulled by handling, the unbroken circle whispering like a patient breath. "Candles should reveal," he said, "not blind." She gave him a look reserved for commanders who flirt with philosophy while their cities tilt. "They mean to blind," she answered. Kalen materialized at the parapet's edge. Its glow dimmed until it resembled a grieving torch. "Seraphian advances no columns today. Their calculus waits. Probability favors inner fracture as the more efficient path to conquest." Its tone was calm, but beneath the syllables hummed an unease too subtle for mortals to register. "They wait for us to drown ourselves in our own ritual," Jalen said, climbing the stairs with a notebook crammed into his coat. His face was lined from sleeplessness, ink streaking his knuckles. "The vigil has begun rewriting stories. Children are told the Sabbath was stolen by heretics. Families argue over which prayers count as loyal. They no longer know whether to believe ovens or candles. Vardamir gazed at the beacon, unblinking, as if daring it to admit origin. "Then we will teach them a different prayer," he said, "one that belongs to hands, not halls." By midday, he entered the sanctuary steps, where the Primarch of the chorus presided amid a forest of candles. The air was thick, sweet with wax and incense, suffocating in its reverence. Thousands watched, their faces striped with flame. "Lord of Refusal," the Primarch declared, her voice carrying like iron poured down a mould. "If you will not rescind endings, confess your doubt before this vigil. Kneel to continuity, or be named the wound." The crowd swayed, a tide of fear disguised as faith. Vardamir did not kneel. He opened his palm, showing the coin, small and unimpressive, against the cathedral of fire. "Continuity is not courage," he said. "It is memory afraid to change its clothes. I have worn it too long. I will not wear it again." Murmurs surged, some stunned, some furious. The Primarch's eyes flared with certainty. "Then you betray not only eternity but the people who trusted it." "Trust is not obedience," he answered. "It is risk, and I risk myself before you now. Witness me, not as immortal, but as fallible." He pressed the coin against his collar once more, and the bolts that had long sealed him to eternity hissed, faint smoke rising where metal met flesh. A gasp rippled. For the first time in centuries, he let his body sag under its true weight. The Primarch recoiled as though he had desecrated the altar. "You weaken the Empire." "No," Jalen cried out, stepping forward, voice raw with peril. "He strengthens it, because at last it breathes with us." Chaos boiled. Some threw down candles, others lifted them higher. The vigil split, one flame devouring itself in rage, the other trembling toward mercy. Arcasa drew her sword and faced the Primarch, who summoned her choir deacons, their robes lined with hidden steel. Blades flashed in the sanctified smoke. The steps became battlefield. Vardamir did not raise a weapon. He stepped among the crowd, steady as stone, lifting fallen children, guiding elders toward the kitchens, his presence an axis that refused to spin with fury. Kalen flooded the steps with a frequency that bent steel to hesitation. Swords wavered, strikes slowed as though time itself held its breath. Yet betrayal flowered in silence. The smiling captain, once reprieved, appeared beside Jalen, dagger unsheathed beneath the folds of his coat. His eyes glowed with the reflection of the beacon, his lips curved with devotion to something older than loyalty. The blade rose for Jalen's throat. Vardamir moved faster than thought, shoulder striking the captain aside. The dagger cut his arm, bolt sparking, pain shuddering like memory through every century of his flesh. Arcasa seized the traitor and drove him to stone, her blade pressing just enough to promise consequence. The crowd roared, not in unity, but in division, half crying traitor, half crying martyr. The Primarch, seizing the moment, raised her reliquary, its cracked seam blazing white. "See," she thundered, "even his blood rebels. He cannot govern endings without birthing betrayal." Oriel's voice pierced from the rear of the crowd, calm as water over stone. Or perhaps betrayal is the tithe exacted by false gods. She strode forward, river cloak damp with mist, her presence undeniable. Candles that blind are lies. Candles that reveal must be trusted to show the face of grief. He has shown his. The vigil faltered, torn between fire and flood. Candles dropped into puddles, sputtering out with faint sighs. The Primarch's reliquary cracked further, light spilling uncontrolled, no longer beacon, but wound. Vardamir, bleeding but unbowed, raised his coin. "Endings are not betrayal," he said, voice ragged. "They are the promise that love was real, and I will not erase love to preserve fear." The reliquary shattered with a sound like glass, learning to pray. Light burst across the steps, blinding for an instant, then fading to ash. When the vision cleared, the Primarch was gone, vanished into smoke, her deacons scattering with her. Silence followed, thick with awe and exhaustion. Then, from the kitchens, bells rang, a call for bread. The people turned one by one, leaving the ruined steps for warmth, for sustenance, for the living Sabbath that still endured. Vardamir staggered, his arm burning where the dagger had opened him. Arcesa steadied him, her grip firm. "You bleed," she said, astonished. "Yes," he murmured, "at last." Oriel looked at him not with triumph but with sorrow. "You will bleed more before the end, and they will not forgive you for showing it." He nodded, accepting the prophecy like weather. "Then let my blood be their witness." Night fell, quiet but watchful, as the beacon over the river flickered once, twice, then steadied again, brighter than before. The Empire had chosen nothing yet, but it had learned that its immortal could bleed, and that knowledge was a seed both dangerous and divine. Dawn arrived like metal cooled too quickly, brittle at the edges, and the city moved beneath it with the hush of a household that has already divided its heirlooms. The beacon over the river held steady, as a careful pulse, yet the steps lay charred. Arguments cooled into ruin. Vardamir bound his arm with linen steamed above an oven while Arcesa checked the gate by touch, and Kaelin dimmed to a pilgrim's glow, reporting that the outer forts had chosen paperwork over people. Jalin arrived with a notebook fattened by night and said the vigil had split into 2 liturgies, one that warmed and one that burned. "Today they will not storm us," Kaelin added. "Probability favors an inner seizure." "Then we will be present where they pretend we are not," Vardamir answered, and he walked toward the palace. Inside, the Chancellor waited with captains polished of battlefield and choir deacons dressed as clerks. His name was Revek, a careful man whose smile resembled a signature. "Continuity petitions this hall," he said, gesturing toward the throne beneath the dome, the machine that preferred winners. "You have weakened the covenant. We will assist by resuming it." Vardamir did not sit. "Continuity without remorse is embalming," he said. Revek opened his hands. "We propose stewardship. You retain reverence. We provide governance. Your bleeding has moved the crowd, but blood stains policy. Let us be clean for you." "And the Sabbath?" "Postponed," he promised, and the word walked the room like a gentle jailer. Vardamir felt the coin warm in his palm, 9 broken crowns circling the unbroken center, and he placed it on the throne's arm, but did not sit. "Witness," he murmured. The machine's hum soured. "Your sentiment is a breach," he said. "The Empire must return to silence." The first blow arrived as audit. Clerks unrolled warrants. Deacons raised reliquaries. Captains moved to seize kitchens under colour of order. "Hold the ovens," Arcesa snapped. Kaelin widened its light to make shadows honest, and Jalin whispered names like a ladder lowering. Then came the chord like rain inside glass, tuned to make loyalty feel late. Arcesa crushed a censer under her boot. Smoke leapt pleading. Kaelin inverted the chord and fed back silence. The deacons reeled. Captains declared a regency to stabilize succession. The throne brightened like a courthouse. Revek beckoned Vardamir with scholar's gentleness. "Let us carry the weight. Retire with honor." A figure who refused to bleed adjudicated us into this, Vardamir answered, and pressed the coin to a spinal node beneath the throne. The crowns flashed. The circle refused spectacle. The machine remembered hands that died and dimmed. Wire nooses flew. Arquiza broke them with the care she used to break bread. Jalen hurled his notebook, and truth became paper weather. Kalen turned chandeliers into rain. Seraphian arrived as law. Curfew scrolled across the sky. Auditors sealed gates to refugees while inspectors entered singing. A barge pivoted in compliance and crushed the ferry bearing nurses. "Out," Vardamir ordered. "We do not defend halls, we defend hunger." Arquiza carved a corridor through panic, and the angel taught smoke to guide rather than hide. Ravek lunged for the air coin. Vardamir tossed it to Jalen, who caught it as if he had intercepted a century. They ran by kitchen stairs into heat that smelled of flour. Bakers lifted paddles like shields. A boy shoved water into Vardamir's hand with an authority that made princes obsolete. Behind them, the dome let go, constellations surrendering to dust. The machine throne sagged into rubble it had always deserved to be. Revek proclaimed regency over ruins. Even the echoes refused to co-sign. For now, only. Candles burned beside bowls of soup. Chalk rings glowed where rain had kissed them. Soldiers turned guns into staffs for elders crossing torn streets. The chorus gathered on a bridge and sang scaffolding. Oriel answered with ferries braided into prayer, pulling survivors from legal water. Kalen stitched paths through smoke, and Arquiza held a square with 30 tired hearts and a hymn uglier than fear. Jalen returned the coin on a bakery roof. The circle felt ordinary, which was the miracle. "Tonight we lose the palace and keep the city," Vardamir said. Kalen folded radiance to a pilot light and watched the east where statutes marched like cavalry. "They will bring famine clauses next," the angel warned. "Then we will evolve appetite into argument," Oriel called from the river stair. Revek unfurled decrees that deputized hunger and criminalized rest. Commissaries shuttered. Curfew tried to make kitchens forget their names. Street by street, the city answered with small ruptures. Ward mothers opened cupboards. Quartermasters wrote receipts for mercy and filed them in their own pockets. Sentries chalked ration lines so weapons lost their nerve. On the river, the beacon repeated steadiness until steadiness became defiance. At midnight, Revek attempted benevolence, broadcasting amnesty to any cohort that delivered the immortal for neutral stewardship. The smiling captain, bruised from shame and almost redeemed, folded the warrant into a bird and set it alight. The crowd watched it lift and fail without clapping. Toward morning, the outer forts, obedient to clauses, turned back the first bread convoy. Arquiza took 2 squads, walked the convoy around the law by way of schoolyards and funeral alleys, and returned with loaves-like arguments that refused translation. She handed one to Vardamir and said, "Eat." He did, and tasted the future he meant to govern. By dawn, the palace hill smoked like a conscience, the crown in fragments no one wanted to sweep, and Revek's banners hung over civic halls that had not earned them. The empire burned and was born in the same heat. Vardamir closed his fingers over the coin and felt the unbroken circle pulse once, like a promise that belonged to mouths rather than monuments. He stepped into alleys where ovens taught darkness to taste of courage, and the beacon kept its impossible steadiness above a river that had learned his name without asking permission. The city had no palace now, only scars where marble once dictated obedience, and yet the streets seemed lighter, as if the ruin itself had unshackled them. Vardamir walked through alleys where children chalked mercy into circles, his cloak damp with flour and smoke. And though people bowed less than they once did, their eyes clung to him with the gravity of need. Arcasa remained close, sword still drawn, lips pressed into silence that tasted of both loyalty and anger. She had bled for the walls and lost them, yet she followed him as if walls had never been the point. Kaelin hovered low, its glow faint, whispering risk in statistical hymns. The regions hold 3 civic halls, it said. They issue decrees criminalizing hunger, yet famine answers no laws. Probability of riot rises with every hour of curfew. Vardamir touched the coin in his palm and found it cool, as though refusing to rehearse destiny. "We will not riot," he said. "We will feed." Jalen appeared from shadow, notebook heavy, his eyes red. "I have written the stories they tell in the halls. They cast you as an idle, bleeding false blood, a theatre of pity. Yet in the streets, they whisper another, the immortal who chose to bruise. 2 gospels march against each other, and neither waits for permission." At the river, Oriel's ferries groaned under refugees smuggled past decrees. She greeted him with arms wet from rope, her voice flat with fatigue. "Every crossing risks seizure. Revik waits for one of us to falter. He feeds on contradiction." "And what do you feed?" Vardamir asked. She met his gaze, old quarrels burning soft. "On proof that endings are honest. Yours most of all." Night gathered, bruised with smoke. The chorus sang vigil still, its light trembling against hunger. Bread lines coiled like prayers through the city, guarded by soldiers who no longer remembered if they obeyed law or love. Arcasa crouched beside a boy whose father had not returned from the convoys. She gave him her gauntlet, heavy as a vow. "Hold it," she told him. "It is a shield, not a chain." He gripped it, and his eyes steadied. Later, beneath the broken dome of the palace ruins, Vardamir stood with his companions. The beacon still flared steady, refusing to blink. "The regents will strike harder," Kaelin warned. "Next, they will weaponize remembrance. They will make the past bleed until the future surrenders." Vardamir looked at his scar, felt pain at last, not as punishment, but as belonging. "Then let us remember better," he said. The words hung, fragile yet alive, and for a moment the ruins themselves seemed to listen. The night closed around them, heavy with choices still unmade, and in the silence between breaths, the Empire felt both closer to birth and nearer to collapse than it had ever been. The city braced beneath a sky of bruised steel, the beacon above the river still unbroken, as if daring all things mortal to learn its patience. The regents issued decrees that arrived like chains sewn into paper, demanding loyalty receipts stamped in yesterday's ink, demanding remembrance only of victories never earned. Soldiers read them aloud with hollow mouths, while the hungry folded them into kindling for ovens that refused to go dark. Vardamir walked the market square where bread lines wound through chalk circles, his wound still raw beneath the linen. The weight of his blood now a language the people could not forget. Arcasa followed, her silence ironclad, her eyes searching every shadow for the betrayal that would inevitably step forward. Jalen carried his notebook close to his chest, recording fragments, mutterings, the way the Empire redefined itself in whispers before it dared to in-law. At dusk, the first assault of memory arrived. Choir deacons descended the steps with reliquaries glowing, and each reliquary sang the names of the dead, but not as mourners speak them, rather as accusations. Mothers heard their lost children blamed on Sabbath idleness. Veterans heard their brothers condemned for resting instead of fighting. Crowds bent under the weight of grief turned against them. Panic festered. The regents had weaponized remembrance, turning sorrow into knives. Vardamir stood in the square's center, refusing to raise a blade. He lifted the coin, small against the enormity of grief, and spoke. "I grieve with you," he said, voice rough but steady. "But grief is not obedience. It is proof we have loved. If they make your dead into chains, remember, chains can be broken." His words clung to air like embers refusing rain. For a heartbeat, people listened. Oriel's ferries cut across the river under moonlight, their lanterns casting silver ladders on the current. She shouted from the shore, her voice carrying like tide. "Come to the water, let remembrance be carried, not caged." Families surged toward her call, grief spilling from reliquaries into the river where the current bore it away. The choir's song faltered. The regent's spell cracked. Arkesa's sword flashed once, striking a reliquary to the ground, its light extinguished in the mud. She planted her boot upon it and declared, "We will not bow to echoes." The crowd roared with her, and the spell broke entirely. Night swelled, heavy and uncertain. Fires smouldered on the steps, and the unbroken beacon watched without blinking. Kaelin, dim and reverent, whispered, "They will try again. Each assault will refine itself. Yet today we learned grief does not belong to rulers." Vardamir touched the coin, feeling its cool defiance, and gazed toward the ruins of the palace, where shadows thickened with plots yet unborn. "Then tomorrow," he murmured, "we will answer them with something stronger than remembrance." The city breathed around him, weary but unbroken, caught between ruin and beginning. The morning after grief had been bent and broken, the city woke beneath a hush like waiting breath. Smoke lingered in alleys, curling over chalk circles, scuffed by restless boots, while the river carried scraps of extinguished reliquaries out to sea. The regents did not send decrees that day. Instead, their silence pressed on the streets like a hand promising punishment. Vardamir stood on the roof of the ruined dome, bandages darkened with blood, the coin cold in his palm. Below, people looked up at him, not with awe, but with the wary recognition reserved for one who might still fail them. Arkesa joined him, her armor dented, her jaw clenched. "They are gathering at the east," she said. "Not priests this time. Soldiers, whole companies sworn to law, not love. And Revek with them, carrying banners that read only your name." The irony sat bitter on her tongue. "They will call it justice when they take you." Kaelin emerged from the stairwell, its glow fractured, voice subdued. "The probability of betrayal within our ranks has risen. They have promised captains amnesty in exchange for your capture. They have promised immortality restored, if only they deliver you bound." The angel's words trembled faintly, as if it feared to be correct. Jalen arrived last, notebook under his arm, his eyes hollow from watching too much. "I heard it among the witnesses," he whispered. "Some believe your blood was only theatre, that you staged your wound to hold them loyal. Doubt breeds faster than famine." He looked down, ashamed to speak what truth demanded. Vardamir closed his hand over the coin until the edges dug into flesh. "If they doubt, it is because I taught them to worship certainty. Now they seek certainty in betrayal." His gaze fell eastward, where banners moved like approaching storms. "I will not flee. If I must be bound, let it be where all can witness." At dusk, they marched to the square, where the ovens burned stubbornly and chalk rings glowed faint under lanterns. The regent's soldiers approached in ordered lines, faces hidden behind visors etched with crowns. Revek rode at their head, robes immaculate, his smile a careful wound. "Vardamir," he called, "you have bled, you have confessed, but still you divide. The Empire requires unity. Surrender yourself, and your people will be spared." The crowd trembled. Some cried out for him to resist, others begged him to yield. Jalen gripped his sleeve, whispering, "If you go, you teach them obedience. If you fight, you teach them courage. Either choice births betrayal." Vardamir stepped forward alone, lifting the coin high so it caught the lantern light. "Witness," he said, his voice carrying across every wall and alley. "If unity is bought with chains, then let me be the price. But know this, chains break." Revek's soldiers surged, and the city gasped, caught between fear and faith, as the unbroken beacon flared brighter than ever, refusing to blink. The square became a crucible of light and shadow. Revek's soldiers advanced in disciplined silence, visors glinting with the reflection of the beacon, their steps striking the stones like a slow drumbeat of inevitability. The people pressed close to the ovens, clinging to the warmth as though bread might shield them from steel. Vardamir stood unarmed, the coin raised high, his blood seeping again through linen that could no longer disguise the frailty of his body. Arkiza drew her sword with the sound of iron remembering its purpose and moved to his side, her eyes fierce. "If you fall," she said, "I fall beside you." Kalen hovered above, radiance trembling, its voice fractured. Probability now escapes calculation. The future has become indeterminate. Jalen's hand shook as he clutched his notebook, pages fluttering in the sudden wind that rose from nowhere. Revek rode forward, his robes immaculate, his smile calm as poison. "See," he shouted to the crowd, "the immortal surrenders himself. This is justice. This is order restored." His words struck like lashes, and doubt rippled through the onlookers. Some began to kneel, others wept, torn between safety and faith. Vardamir lowered the coin slightly, feeling the weight of centuries press into his palm, and he whispered, not to Revek, not even to the crowd, but to the circle itself, "Let them see truth, not theatre." At that instant, the beacon over the river flared, flooding the square with white brilliance that dissolved the visors of Revek's soldiers, revealing their faces, men and women, weary, terrified, human. The crowd gasped, and the soldiers faltered, their steps broken, their discipline undone by their own revealed vulnerability. One dropped his weapon, then another, until the sound of steel clattering became louder than the drum of boots. Revek's calm shattered. "Hold your lines," he roared. "Do not be deceived. The beacon is treachery." He dismounted, snatching a blade from one of his faltering guards, and rushed toward Vardamir with a zealot's fury. Arkiza met him, steel flashing, and their blades struck sparks in the beacon's light. The duel was brief but brutal, each blow echoing across the silent crowd. Revek fought like a man who believed himself already victorious, but Arkiza fought like a woman who had carried the weight of loyalty too long to drop it now. With a final thrust, she drove her sword through his chest. Revek collapsed at Vardamir's feet, blood darkening his immaculate robes. The crowd erupted, not in triumph, but in a roar of grief and revelation. Some wept for the fallen regent, others shouted for the empire to be free at last. The soldiers scattered, broken between loyalty and survival. Vardamir lifted the coin once more, his voice ragged. "Witness, unity bought with chains is no unity at all. Tonight we bleed together, or not at all." The beacon pulsed in answer, unbroken, while the empire teetered on the edge of its final choice. The body of Revek lay cooling on the stones, his blood mingling with the dust of the ruined square, and the silence that followed was heavier than any battle cry. The crowd stood frozen between awe and dread, staring at Vladimir as though he had torn the sky open. Arcasa lowered her sword slowly, her breath ragged, her eyes fixed on the man she had killed not with hatred, but with duty. Jalen's notebook slipped from his hands, pages scattering like frightened birds, words fleeing before they could become history. Kalen dimmed almost to nothing, as if the angel itself feared what had been unleashed. Vladimir swayed, the linen at his arm soaked through, the bolts in his body humming faintly with the residue of eternity they had once enforced. He felt every heartbeat now as a burden, each pulse heavier than the centuries that had once passed without consequence. The coin in his palm was cool, the circle plain, its defiance unadorned. He lifted it one final time, and his voice carried with the weary strength of a man who had nothing left to preserve. Witness, the empire you clung to is gone. Continuity is dust. If you build anew, let it be with love that dares to end, not chains that pretend to last forever. The people stirred. Some fell to their knees in relief. Others shouted in anger, unwilling to accept that their immortal was merely flesh. A mother lifted her child high towards him, as if to demand a blessing he could no longer give. Soldiers dropped weapons, ashamed of the weight they had carried for others. Auriel appeared at the edge of the square, river cloak heavy with spray, her eyes searching his face, not for victory, but for the truth of what remained. "You have given them the choice," she said softly. "But choices are crueler than tyrants." Vladimir nodded, his strength faltering. Arcasa moved to steady him, but he pushed her hand away gently. "I must fall on my own," he whispered. He stepped down from the broken plinth where he had stood and walked into the crowd. They parted, hesitant, as if uncertain whether to touch him or recoil. He let them see his weakness, the tremor in his steps, the blood staining his cloak. "I was never your god," he said, his voice cracking. "I was your mirror. Now break me, if you must, and see yourselves instead." The beacon above the river pulsed once, bright as a final heartbeat, then dimmed to ordinary starlight. The unbroken crown dissolved into the night, leaving only silence. Vladimir sank to his knees in the dust, the coin falling from his hand, rolling once before coming to rest at Jalen's feet. The people watched, torn between grief and wonder, as their immortal bowed to mortality at last. And in that silence, the empire ended, not with thunder, but with a breath released, fragile as dawn,